The problem with Vice President Gore and other global warming extremists is that they distort the science, grossly exaggerate the risks, argue that anyone who disagrees with them is corrupt, and suggest that solutions are easy and cheap. And that's an all too convenient fiction. Perhaps Gore's most disturbing claim is that climate change is not a political issue, but a moral issue. Yet what he wants to do involves large political interventions in the economy and a vast expansion of government power. He says he wants to use markets, but what he really means is that he wants to pass laws making energy much more expensive. That is a truth so inconvenient to Gore's agenda that he conceals it in his movie. One of the defects, I think, of Vice President Gore's approach to this issue is that he begins from a standpoint of philosophical pessimism that sees man as deeply separated from nature by technology. And that's why he calls for things like a wrenching transformation of society to solve the problem of climate change. This seems to me to be very doubtful and maybe even dangerous, because it suggests that we can solve some very deep human problems through politics. We've never been able to do that, and I don't think it's compatible with democracy. Climate change really boils down to three issues. One is what's happening right now. The second issue is what's likely to happen in the future. And the third issue is what are the reasonable policy prescriptions we might consider adopting to deal with the uncertain risk of climate change. And that's what I'm trying to talk about in this film and in the work I do both for the Pacific Research Institute and the American Enterprise Institute. We need to step back a moment, catch our breath, and consider a few things Gore and other extremists leave out of their account of the end of the world. Thank you all for coming out today to talk about this difficult and contentious subject of climate change. As everyone knows and has heard, former Vice President Gore has a now famous PowerPoint show about climate change made into a hit movie, and I thought since he has one, I should have one too. It's not really my purpose to debate Vice President Gore or anybody else point by point. Much of what Vice President Gore says about climate change is correct. The planet is warming. Human beings are playing a substantial role in that warming. How large that warming is going to be and how we ought to respond to it is still an open question. But beyond that, which might be described as the general consensus, the Vice President and a lot of other people make some extreme claims about what is likely to happen in the future that are not backed up by the science. And beyond that, they're saying also that the debate should now be closed, that the science is settled, that there are no important questions left open, and that there is a firm consensus that we are headed toward inevitable catastrophe. It is claimed that human civilization itself is at risk, that billions of people might die. Now, if you pay close attention to the people saying this, you will notice that with one or two notable exceptions, such as NASA's chief climate scientist James Hansen, most of the people who make these extreme claims are not scientists, but politicians, headline-seeking journalists, environmental advocates, and windy Anglican bishops who can't understand why people aren't coming to church anymore on Sunday. So the subject has become so politicized that it's almost impossible to have a rational and calm conversation about climate. Either you are an alarmist or you are a skeptic, and both terms have acquired a lot of pejorative baggage. It's considered an act of bad faith to mention uncertainty in the science, even though nearly every scientific article you will read mentions uncertainty in what we know about the subject. And finally, some really extraordinary things are being said about anyone who dares to dissent from the view that catastrophe is upon us. People like me are sometimes now called climate change deniers, with the none too subtle suggestion that we are the moral equivalent of Holocaust deniers. Not long ago, an environmental writer wrote on a prominent environmental website that someday, 10 or 20 years from now, we should have Nuremberg trials for climate skeptics. Now, the fellow hastily retracted that statement, partly after I sent him an email, since I know him slightly, saying, "Dave, have you lost your mind? But who can doubt that that really captures the ferocity of some of the views of the climate alarmists? And so, for example, not long ago, last week in fact, a columnist for The Guardian newspaper in England wrote the following: "Every time someone dies as a result of floods in Bangladesh, an airline executive should be dragged out of his office and drowned." Now, I'm starting to rethink my skepticism about hate speech legislation after reading something like that. Or even NASA's James Hansen wrote this recently in the New York Review of Books. Quote, "A certain shock treatment is needed, but it would best be delivered with a 2x4 as a solid whack to the head of politicians who remain oblivious to fundamental physical facts." Close quote. Well, now, Dr. Hansen's a nice fellow. I've debated him a couple of times, and I'm certain he means that as a metaphorical statement. But on the other hand, is it so unthinkable that some extremists might someday act on statements like that? I mean, it strikes me that the Weather Underground from the 1960s might make a comeback, and they wouldn't even need to change their name. Well, what's also said about people who don't agree with the party line on catastrophe is that we're spreading disinformation and confusion. That somehow the public's not getting the message. And I find this kind of bizarre given the lavish media coverage. Time magazine does a regular issue on climate catastrophe every few months, it seems. And sometimes I think maybe we should be flattered. I mean, is it really plausible that a tiny handful of skeptical individuals are managing to outweigh environmental activist groups with multi-million-dollar budgets, not to mention national governments committed to this issue? It seems a little implausible when you think about the amount of publicity that goes on. Here's two more from Time magazine, if you just keep going back. Vanity Fair's green issue, printed, I note, on non-recyclable paper. And Wired magazine talks about the climate crisis. One of the things we now see a lot in the media coverage is that we're reaching a climate tipping point. You know, if Malcolm Gladwell had a nickel for every time people use the phrase tipping point, well, I think he's actually sold a book every time someone says tipping point. But I wanted to do sort of a little calculation on how much the tipping point language is being used. And so I did a cliche alert test on Nexus, searching for the terms climate change and tipping point. And you can see we've gone from under 200 in 2001 up to about 1,300 through November of 2006. Why am I interested in this subject in the first place? Well, I've been researching and writing about the environment for almost 20 years, and I like to say that the environment is much too important to be left to environmentalists. I grew up in the suburbs of Los Angeles in the 1960s when the smog was so bad I couldn't breathe most summer afternoons. I couldn't go outside and play, and if I did try to go outside and play, I'd usually have to go inside and lie down for the rest of the afternoon. And one of the things that interested me later on in graduate school in Southern California was how much the smog was starting to diminish. In fact, what's happened in Los Angeles in the last generation is that the population has doubled, the number of cars on the road has tripled, and smog levels have fallen by more than 75%. You can actually see the mountains now, which you couldn't do when I was a child growing up. Well, that's a good example of how we can actually make progress on the environment, even as our economy and population continue to grow. In the early 1990s, I started studying environmental trend data more closely. Because one of the things that is interesting and upsetting about environmental issues is that most Americans think that the environment in the United States is getting worse. That's what they tell pollsters by a huge margin. And in fact, what our data show is that in most areas, not all areas, but most areas, environmental quality in the U.S. is improving rapidly and dramatically. So that's why I started doing the annual report, the Index of Leading Environmental Indicators for the Pacific Research Institute, was to try and tell that story, try and explore where we are making progress in the environment, and most importantly, why we're making progress on the environment. That way we can apply the lessons of success to areas where we're not making as rapid a progress. How do we know that climate change is happening? An awful lot of this issue seems to go forward in the public mind through signs and wonders. So, for example, we hear a lot about hurricanes these days. We see videos of ice, the ice cap shrinking in Antarctica, or of icebergs breaking off the Ross ice shelf in Antarctica. One of my favorite signs and wonders is this one. This one goes around the internet a lot. This isn't so far off what you sometimes hear. One of my favorite indicators is what I call the armadillo indicator. Dr. Hansen, and I'm sorry to keep picking on him, but he's so prominent in this issue. In his recent speeches, he's been citing a letter he got from a farmer in Arkansas saying, every year I notice armadillos moving further north because the climate is changing. Well, the real evidence comes from this data series of the temperature of the Earth. And what it shows is the temperature record for about the last 150 years and a net increase of about 0.6 degrees Celsius. And if you look closely, one of the things you notice is we had a leg up between about 1910 and 1940, and then it's flat for 40 years between 1940 and 1980, or even slightly down, and then another leg up in the last 20 years or so. Now, there was some controversy for a while about the reliability of this temperature record, but most of those doubts have been smoothed out, most of the uncertainties eliminated, and this is pretty well accepted to be the temperature record that we have experienced in the last 150 years. So a number of questions occur to you right away. First of all, is this extraordinary? We'll talk about that in a minute. Also, is it uniform? And this is an important point. Turns out that while this is the average temperature of the globe going up, it's not happening uniformly everywhere in the world. In fact, it tends to be concentrated in the polar regions. This is a NASA false color image, they call it, of the globe back in the winter of 2001. And not surprisingly, the red areas are areas that are warmer. The lighter colored areas are areas that have less change from the long-term record. And you can see that the warming is concentrated especially in the alpine regions and on the Antarctic Peninsula down at the bottom there, which we will talk about in a moment. NASA will also give you this image, which is 30 years worth of temperature anomalies in the Arctic region, concentrated over Alaska and Western Canada and Siberia. It's this phenomenon especially that yields these very dramatic images that Vice President Gore and others use of glaciers retreating. Here's the Muir Glacier in 1941 in Alaska, and the same spot in the year 2000. Now, what this means in the grand scheme of things, I mean, these are very dramatic pictures and are very captivating of your imagination. What they mean in the grand scheme of things is less clear for some reasons we'll get into. For a very long time, it was thought that this was the climate history of the planet for the last 1,000 years. This chart was taken from the 1990 report of the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And if you don't follow this subject, the IPCC is the official international body set up to assess the science on climate change and advise world leaders on what might or should be done about it. And so it was thought we had a medieval warm period about 1,000 years ago, and maybe some of you have heard some of the stories of Vikings going to Greenland, planting wheat, grazing cattle. There's some accounts in Chinese folklore of Chinese sailors sailing in an ice-free Arctic Ocean. Can't really know if those stories are reliable since we don't have maps from those ages. But the point is that if the medieval warm period, and then followed by the Little Ice Age and the sort of late Renaissance period, was correct, it would mean that it was possible that the warming we're experiencing right now is not extraordinary. And by the way, how did the medieval warm period happen? I mean, there weren't too many SUVs on the road 1,000 years ago. So there must be some natural reasons for climate variation. Well, this was the accepted wisdom for quite a while, good 15 or 20 years. And then about 10 years ago, along came this finding. This is the famous hockey stick chart. And what you notice here is a very sharp rise in temperature in recent years. This is 1,000 years on the scale from roughly the year 1000 to 2000. The medieval warm period disappears. The Little Ice Age disappears. And suddenly it was claimed that we were now the warmest we had been by quite a lot in the last 1,000 years. Now there was a problem. A lot of people who looked closely at the methodology and the temperature proxies, that is the ways we estimated temperatures 600, 700, 800 years ago from things like ice core samples, bristlecone pine trees. That's an interesting one to think about. There were criticisms of both the proxies that were used and the statistical methods used to produce this chart. And the controversy got so intense that the National Academy of Sciences appointed an expert panel to review the hockey stick and to see what they made of it, if they could confirm its findings or say there's some problems here. Now, the report came out a few months ago, and most of the media reports said hockey stick confirmed, or headlines to that effect. Of course, if you read the whole report more closely, it was hedged in the usual way scientists often do this. What they said was This temperature reconstruction is plausible. However, they went on to say, we really can have no confidence in our temperature reconstruction beyond about 400 years back. We simply don't have enough data, enough proxies to go on. And they added a number of the statistical techniques that were criticized look shaky to them. So in fact, they validated a number of the criticisms that were made. One of the members of the panel was Kurt Cuffey from the University of California at Berkeley, and he said this to Science magazine about the hockey stick chart. The IPCC used it as a visual prominently in the 2001 report. I should pause for a moment and say that, to mix metaphors, the hockey stick was thought to be the smoking gun of human-caused climate change. And so it was used very prominently in that 2001 report. So to continue with Cuffey, I think that sent a very misleading message about how resolved this part of the scientific research was. Close quote. That doesn't sound to me like settled science, that there's no debate or uncertainty or further investigation to be had. More recently, reconstructions of the same data using different statistical techniques gets this set of curves for the last 1,000 years temperature history. And what you see is the medieval warm period reappearing, along with the little ice age reappearing. Or if you want to look at just some recent articles in Science magazine in the last year, there up on the top, medieval warm period, back in the scientific literature. Or down here underlined is medieval warm period and little ice age. That doesn't sound like a settled science or consensus to me about the hockey stick. And sure enough, the hockey stick is unlikely to appear in the next report of the IPCC that's due out about 12 months from now. Now, this is about the past. What about the future? An awful lot of what we're talking about is trying to guess by some means what the temperature is going to be 50 or 100 years from now and what effects that will have. And so we're doing this with models. Computer models, very fancy and sophisticated computer models. Just to give you an example of how hard this must be, just from a common sense point of view, watch this NASA animation of a month in the life of planet Earth. And our climate models have to figure out not only the effect of greenhouse gases, but the motion and effect of clouds and the different kinds of clouds, the feedback effects of the oceans, what happens to plant and animal life, growth of vegetation, hundreds and thousands of potential feedback loops, you might say, which makes climate modeling one of the most complicated modeling exercises ever done, I think, by computers. Even though our computers get fancier and better all the time, the climate models often take days or weeks to run on the largest supercomputers in the world. There are some simpler aspects to it. I mean, you can really get off in the weeds of climate models, but the basic aspect of this controversy to think on for a moment is trends in especially carbon dioxide, the main greenhouse gas. And what's been going on, and Vice President Gore shows this and explains it quite well in his movie, is that the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has been rising at about 0.5% per year for about a century. And that's what's shown in the top line. It chops up and down. It chops up and down because every year when spring happens in the northern hemisphere, all the trees and plants that leaf out absorb a large amount of carbon dioxide. But the overall level is gradually edging up and is now about 100 parts per million higher than the estimated level in pre-industrial times. Well, what does this all mean? Well, the IPCC's official temperature forecasts are that 100 years from now, global temperatures on average would be in the range of 1.6 degrees Celsius higher to as high as 5.8 degrees Celsius higher than they are today. That's a pretty broad range. I should mention, by the way, that advanced copies of the next IPCC report that are circulating in draft suggest they're going to lower their top-end forecast down to about 4.5 degrees Celsius. And that they're also going to reduce their estimate of the human impact on climate change by, the early report is, 25%. Interesting little tidbit emerging in the science right now. This chart explains why we get the range between 1.6 degrees on the low end and 5.8 degrees on the high end. It depends entirely on the emissions forecasts for greenhouse gases for the next century. If we keep going at more or less the present rate of greenhouse gases increasing in the atmosphere by about 0.5% a year, you get the low end, the red line on that chart. And it gives you a fairly low temperature increase forecast. The high temperature forecast comes from the assumption that greenhouse gas emissions are going to soar, more than double the amount that accumulates in the atmosphere. And that is based on assumptions of very, very high rates of economic growth. For example, one of the scenarios they uses suggests that North Korea will catch up to the United States in per capita income by the year 2100. I mean, not just our per capita income now, but our per capita income in the year 2100. That's how much faster than the US the IPCC thinks that the economy will grow. A lot of people have noticed that these scenarios are not credible and realistic, and is one reason probably why their forecasts of temperature rise are going to come down in the next report. It also assumes very low rates of technological substitution. I mean, on the surface you might say, well, look, we hear about India and China. China is going to pass the United States in 3 years as the world's leading emitter of greenhouse gases. But it's worth thinking about the fact that when China does that in 3 years, they will still have an economy less than a third as large as the United States, which means what? It means their economy is extraordinarily energy inefficient, and that there are large gains to be had in their greenhouse gas emissions profile as well as their economy from acquiring some basic energy efficiencies. And that's something they're really after in a pretty serious way. That's another way of saying that these projections of very high rates of greenhouse gas emissions growth are unrealistic and unduly pessimistic, which is another way of saying that the overwhelming likelihood, if the models are right about the effect of greenhouse gases on temperature, is that we're looking at a modest increase in global temperatures over